You might have heard about children in Gaza going missing, kidnapped by Israeli soldiers. It's so evil it sounds utterly absurd. But Israel's done this kind of thing before. I'm talking about a mass kidnapping that happened when Israel declared itself a state, when thousands of children disappeared and never returned. But they weren't Palestinian, they were Jewish. It's 1948. Zionist militias have just razed hundreds of Palestinian villages, displaced 750,000 Palestinians. There are about 650,000 Jews living there. The majority were recent settlers who'd moved to Palestine as part of the Zionist project, come to be known were Central or Eastern European, or what's called Ashkenazi Jews. They pioneered the Zionist movement, made up the militias that orchestrated the Nakba, and served in Israel's first political parties and government. But all these European Jews weren't enough to colonize and work all the land that they had taken. If Israel wanted to be a viable state, it would need more Jews. See, there had always been Arab Jews living in Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, as well as in non-Arab countries like Iran and Turkey. But these Jews, Mizrahi Jews as they'd come to be known, came from a very different context. Mizrahi Jews, on the other hand, had been coexisting with their neighbors for centuries and were part of society. And the story behind the huge covered-up crime this video is about starts with one rescue in particular. Operation Magic Carpet.
5,000 Jews escaping terror and slavery in the backward Arab state of Yemen.
Yemeni Jews weren't slaves, they were just poor, like most non-Jewish Yemenis were. In fact, Yemeni Jews had been living there for centuries and had chosen to move to Israel because they wanted to flee poverty and had bought into the biblical narrative. Meanwhile, in Israel, these Yemeni Jews were seen as unclean, primitive, backwards, and a threat to the European civilized image that Israel was trying to build. Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister at the time, had described Mizrahi Jews as rabble and would later say, "We don't want Israelis to become Arabs. It is incumbent upon us to struggle against the spirit of the Levant, which corrupts individuals and societies." But the Yemenis were still brought in. Why? One Zionist leader said that while Ashkenazi Jews were better suited for city work, Yemeni Jews would do well with agriculture because they, quote, need very little. Hence, Operation Magic Carpet. Israel took what was essentially the mass import of cheap labor and spun it into an Orientalist white savior story of rescue and redemption. This racist, supremacist attitude Ashkenazis had towards Mizrahi Jews sets the scene for what happens next. These are the absorption camps where almost 50,000 Yemeni Jews were sent once they arrived in Israel. Tent cities with awful sanitation, where their belongings were taken, they were secularized, and forced to adopt new Hebrew names, abandon their languages and their culture. So Yemeni Jews were seen as people who needed to be civilized into the Israeli way of being, but at the same time, as a people who would, quote, never fully achieve modernity. This turned them into infants in the eyes of the Ashkenazi absorbers, thus taking over every decision regarding Mizrahim and their children seemed natural. That brings us to the kidnapping. Between 1948 and the early 1950s, thousands of babies disappeared. This happened to lots of non-European Jewish families, but the majority were Yemeni. When Yemeni Jews arrived at the absorption camps, their babies were taken from them forcefully to structures called baby houses, under the pretense that these places were in better condition than the unhygienic camps. And from these baby houses, many children disappeared. Cases of Yemeni mothers giving birth, their child being taken away by a nurse, and then never seen again.
ילדתי ילד, ילדתי חתול, עכבר, מה ילדתי? תראו לי אותו. למה אתם לא מראים לי כלום?
Across each scenario, the story was pretty much the same. Parents were told their child had died, but were shown no body, no grave, and no death certificate. Many of these parents believed that their children had not died, but had been taken away from them, and put up for adoption, or sold to childless Ashkenazi couples.
אמרתי לו, אוקיי, בסדר, מת, אז תני לי לראות אותו פעם אחת, וזהו, ללטף אותו, לעשות לו משהו. היא עושה לי לא.
For years, these families campaigned for the truth and for justice, but were met with claims of myth and conspiracy. Decades later, some people were able to reconnect with their missing children through DNA tests. Eventually, testimonies from those involved surfaced. One former senior nurse testified that Yemeni parents were not interested in their children, and that they should have been happy that their child got a good education. Another nurse told a Yemeni woman, "You have lots of children. Why not let us take one of them?" There are plenty of damning testimonies gathered by an NGO called Amram that suggest that this was systematic and widespread. Only in 2016 was this issue finally acknowledged at the state level.
Why, if their identity will not be Middle Eastern, they will be sort of Europeans with dark skin.
Colonizers across the world have done this. From Australia to Canada to Belgium to France, the forcible removal of children and their re-education is standard practice for colonizers. All these places share one core philosophy: white supremacy. It doesn't matter that the Mizrahi Jews were also settlers there to colonize the indigenous Palestinian population. They weren't white, and that made them vulnerable to their own cultural genocide. Zionism was invented by victims of white supremacy as their own version of white supremacy, where they could hold top rank. Mizrahi Jews were safe before, and endangered upon their arrival to the white supremacist colony that saw them as nothing more than a primitive labor force. That these were Arab Jews who culturally, linguistically, historically, had more in common with the Palestinians they were colonizing than the white settlers they were doing it alongside, or under. And so a system was born to keep them subjugated and dilute them of their culture, so they'd be far removed enough to see Palestinians as more of the other than the European settler who had always seen them as inferior. And so when we hear stories about Palestinian children being kidnapped in Gaza, this is not surprising. This is the extension and continuation of a long-held policy that the Zionist entity was built on.